High-stakes testing is central to the neoliberal project in education because the data produced by the tests are used as the metric for determining value, which in turn is used for comparison and competition in the educational marketplace. This is a quote from Wayne O's text, Unequal by Design, and we're going to get into what does that really mean today?
Welcome back to Education in Context, where we interrogate the nuances of anti-Black thinking within schools and reimagine learning in ways that empower students because we know.
What we don't name, we normalize.
I'm your co-host, Larry. I've been in education for 7 years, an administrator at a middle school.
I'm your co-host, Nell, and 10th year in education and also a school administrator. In episode 1, if you were locked in, we talked about the duality of being Black educators and systems that were designed to control and stifle the curiosity of Black and brown children.
Today, we're going to talk about one of those mechanisms within the system, and that is high-stakes standardized testing. To frame our conversation, we've chosen the anchor text from the author Wayne O. His book is titled Unequal by Design, High-Stakes Testing and the Standardization of Inequality. This book critiques the method of standardized testing to help us see the system behind the system of high-stakes standardized testing. O also pushes us to ask ourselves, what are we really standardizing? So let's jump into it. To begin our conversation, we're going to define violence as it relates to standardized testing. And we're not talking about physical harm. We're talking about violence in the way of structural. We're talking about violence in the way of epistemic.
Baby, I think the craziest thing for me about this word violence as it relates to the things that Black and brown people experience is every time I call people out, they're like, what do you mean violent? I had to put my hands on you. And I think that I'm glad that we're framing the conversation with this because I think structural violence describes the ways in which structures we exist in cause psychological, emotional harm or prevent access to things for Black and brown people. And I think when we think about violence in that capacity, it is ever present, right?
I agree.
It is consistently around us in what we experience, not only in the education system, but in the world, right?
I think about school closures, funding cuts. I think about the ways in which students that live in predominantly impoverished neighborhoods do not have access to the same resources that their white counterparts do. That's all a part of the structural violence.
Absolutely. And I think for epistemic violence, we think about, I actually am recently reading, I told you about this, Zaretta Hammond's book, Transforming Your Thinking. She talks about cognitive redlining. And I think this is the type of epistemic violence that we see where Black and brown people, whether they're children or adults in academia, are often barred from access to certain forms of knowledge, or their knowledge production is pathologized or problematized in ways that tell us that, like, you even can't think normally. Like, even your knowledge production is not normal or is not affirmed in civil society. And I think that when we're thinking about epistemic violence, it's the ways in which, like, language and knowledge production is also weaponized against Black and brown people. And so when we're thinking about now standardized testing, it's like, how does it reproduce those things? And that leads us, I think, to our next question.
Yep. How did standardized testing originate as a racial project in U.S. education? Now, this question also brings us to our first quote in this conversation. The quote is found on page 50 of our book. The quote reads, "Eugenics is the debunked science of attaching specific human behaviors and attributes to genetic and biological markers to argue that people were poor or criminals or unintelligent." The first thing I think about when I read this quote is that this is really silly because how can we determine that someone is or isn't smart, intelligent, a criminal, not a criminal, simply by their biological marker? I think this really gets at the way in which racism embeds itself within education because this was the first...
In structures.
Yes, in structures.
And I think that when I'm thinking about this, like, I hear you saying it feels silly, and it's crazy because in my mind, racism is an illogical thing, right?
Yes.
Like, the way in which we can assume someone's characteristics based on biological factors or based on genetic factors isn't a logical thing, but also it's because racism is rooted in fear, which is not logic, right? That is something that is you're feeling in your body, which I genuinely feel that, like, people feel fear as it relates to us because of how we've been socialized, but that is illogical, right?
Yeah.
And it asks us to have to push ourselves to move in a more logical way. To your point about like, this is probably kind of silly that I'm
Yeah.
determining this person's future based on what they look like.
Yeah.
And I think that is what's happening, right? And that's the structural piece when like
Yeah.
third grade test scores are used to create prison cells. And like that's a real thing when we have Black and brown children over policed in schools, over criminalized in schools. Now you didn't do well on your test because you were never in class, because you were always suspended or expelled or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. I also think about the idea when you think about eugenics is this idea that we're ranking, we're sorting people, we're assigning worth to a person because they identify as a certain biological marker. And I think when we think about the historical narrative of, enslaved Black people in the United States, that's exactly what it was. There was a value that was assigned to us, and the value was not of a human life. It was of,
Chattel.
Yeah, chattel slavery. But I was thinking also just like we were a product. We were something that was bought and we were used. And when, we were dead, we were discarded. And so when I think about the ways in which education, systems do not value the Black and brown mind, I think about the ways in which they don't see us as worthy because they don't see us as human.
Yeah, and I think Frank Wilderson talks a little bit about that too. But I think just this idea that like if we are not human, the argument is that structures and systems we exist in were made for humans.
Exactly.
And if we are not recognized as human in civil society, then that means that we're still seeing the like effects of chattel slavery hundreds of years later because of the we're still not recognized as that. We're still seeing majority of the populations in jails of Black people when we only make up, I don't know, 13% of the United States population. Like, so thinking about how we are still seen as not human in these ways is pretty interesting. And I say interesting because it's like people would argue progress has been made, right?
Exactly.
And I think that progress in instances, I guess, if we're thinking about policies that have been implemented, but we've also seen policy reform, policy repeal in regards where we felt like we made progress. And we've also seen shifting of like, I don't know, I wrote a piece one time when I was like maybe in college. I was like, the pictures of the storybook may have changed, but the narrative always stays the same. And that's like a real thing.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, we're not getting lynched anymore in the United States, but like police killings, like what do we call those? Like what do we call like the circulation of those police killings? Like what are we, like, and I think that that's an interesting thing.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about like what happens day to day, in the classroom or in the school building, because I think about like referrals that are being made for students to have IEPs or teacher expectations, or, when you're in high school, you get an opportunity to get placed into class, in what ways do we, because we have internalized this way of thinking about Black and brown minds, those Black and brown minds don't end up in those AP courses, or most Black or most people or students who are IEP students are Black and brown. Is it because they need that service? Is it because they actually can take that AP class, or is it because of the color of their skin? And so I think,
and I even think beyond the color of their skin, I think there are cultural ways in which we exist that do not meet social norms. And then it is problematized or pathologized as like not valuable or bad. And then because of that, then there's an IEP put, because I am unable to connect with you and support you in these ways and have you feel successful in my class, you need additional support. And it's like, or maybe you need additional support in like your instruction to actually meet the needs of a diverse group of students, right? And I think oftentimes in the current systems of education, students are punished for adult gaps, for adult in like what is the word I'm thinking of, for adult, I don't know, like adults not being capable of doing the thing, and we have to over police children because you all are not able to keep them safe or teach them, etc.
Yeah. I think there's definitely a conversation to be had about the ways in which we see our Black children in the classroom setting, and that actually brings us to our next question: how does reducing learning to a single score So we're talking about high-stakes standardized testing, erase the cultural, linguistic, and intellectual assets students bring. And this question is grounded in a quote from our book on page 68, where it reads, "There is nothing natural about using high-stakes standardized testing to measure education. These tests are used to take the very complex and whole process of human learning and turn it into a very unnaturally oversimplified number." And I actually think this is our first example from the quote from the book when we think about epistemic violence, because we are literally reducing students to a number. We don't see them within their culture. We don't see them as a human. We don't see them as a complex being that's navigating so many other things outside of what they're learning in class, because all we care about is them getting a number on a test. So
Absolutely. And I think that when I'm thinking about epistemic violence, I'm thinking about the ways that we do not affirm experiential knowledge. We do not affirm the ways in which people in academia are studying the lived experiences. It's not the other way around. They're not writing the lived experiences and then people are living them, right? Which means that there is knowledge production in existing. And I think something that is interesting here is when it says cultural, linguistic, and intellectual assets students bring, that gets at what Zaretta Hammond is naming around culturally responsive teaching, and not just putting a Black scientist on a slide deck like we talked about before, but also thinking about what value add does this student have? What are the diversified ways I can assess the knowledge this student has gained being in this space? And I think that's what's hard is they're also pushing to get the numbers to stay open. Schools are pushing for those numbers, right? To be able to keep their school running. And it is a tool they need to actually access the top high schools in our city or to access college. So it's existing in this I guess duality of we need this and it's not sufficient. It's not enough,
I was going to say, I think the idea that we push, preparing students to take high stake standardized testing, it forces teachers to be heavy on compliance, heavy on a silent classroom, heavy on controlling every aspect of what you do in a classroom, because we're trying to maximize every minute, because every minute matters. And if we waste a minute, then you're not going to do well on this test that is so important. And I think that, there's implications to that. These are children. These are fifth graders. These are, babies. And so, what role, do I play? I think about my job as a coach for teachers. If I know that I'm in a school that is pushing hey, you need to teach your class a particular way because they have to prepare for this test. And then I have this teacher, when I walk into the classroom, then running their class in a way that is inherently violent, not because they're physically harming the child, but because you are not honoring any part of this child's humanity when you teach them. It's something I'm still interrogating. How do I again live in that duality, and how do I disrupt what I know is not best for children, or what might be harming children in a real way.
Yeah, you're just making me think about I love my girl Chatnika. Chatnika be coming through. And I receive all the critiques about AI. I receive them and I hear them. And I think something that she said to me was I live my life in frameworks, and I think that that's very true. And you just made me think about this idea of why framing is so integral, right? Why framing matters so much, because tools can build and tools can break down. And a hammer could be very helpful for me to build a house. A hammer could also be very harmful if I'm deciding to destroy my ex-boyfriend's car, right? It's the same tool and it's used in a different way. And I think that thinking about in that instance of what you named is a large part of this work is mindset work for that reason.
It is.
Because your mindset informs how you will deploy this instrument. And if you view teachers as you are preparing students to navigate the world, regardless purple, brown, black, blue, then you will deploy that in a particular way in your space. You will support them in understanding that meeting the norms of this space is less about do it because I said so and more about boundary setting,
Yeah.
more about having a safe space to take risk and learn, etc. And you need the framing to be able to do that, but also the teacher needs the mindset to be able to have that framing.
Yeah, and that is something that has to be developed if they don't. I do have a follow-up question. What do we think students lose when learning in a classroom just becomes test prep? I think
Themselves.
yeah, they do. I think the one thing I was thinking about is, this idea that school is a human experience, and when you don't bring that human experience into the classroom because you are so hell-bent, for lack of a better way to say this, on making sure that you get the material so students feel prepared for this test that they're going to take in a couple of months. It's a disservice. They spend the majority of their time with us, during the week, and they don't get a human experience, or the human experience that will help them be more well-rounded in the way that they, interact and exist in the environment. So
I think my push here though would be like, when you do the front end labor around like building relationships, around like curating a particular space, I think you have more room to move more urgent and still affirm their humanity,
Yeah.
etc. I think that people don't on the front end build the belief, like we talked about in our last episode, in students, and build a space that is conducive to them being like, I'm going to take risks, I want to lock in, and they intrinsically want to lock in because of the space you've created.
I also think that's a high level skill set
Yeah.
that we don't see that, in the way of like training teachers, like professional development. Like, that's not something that stands out. I agree with you. And so, I think there is an opportunity for, us as educators to think about, if we know that we want to train teachers to be, to teach in a human centered way, what does that look like, where, we can have a, high pace, we are moving, we are learning lesson without it becoming so punitive. And I don't know,
Yeah, I also think that's tied to the like what we named around structural violence, because I think that the structures that teachers are being asked to uphold are also ones they've internalized. And so it's like, in order for me to create a space where my student feels safe to be their most authentic selves, I have to be my most authentic self. Like, I used to remember people coming in my classroom to observe me and be like, you're just like having fun with the kids. I'm like, because I'm being myself.
Yeah.
Right. And I think you know me on a personal level, like I'm always myself. That's how I show up.
Yeah.
And so it's easier for me to do that with kids and then them feel safe to be themselves
Yeah.
and us do the hard work authentically.
Yeah.
Whereas if I am a person that was deeply insecure and I wore that on my sleeve everywhere I went, it's going to be a lot harder for me to encourage the trait of authenticity in other students if I don't have it in myself. Which is why it's like, yes, mindset work, but also reflective work around like, what is the baggage I'm bringing to this space? What are the things I need to unpack and leave at the door before I go into this classroom, this school building every day? And I don't think adults are like courageous enough to lean in to the authentic version of themselves, which is why they project onto children, and we see the impact of that.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask another question, and the question is, what do educators lose? What do teachers lose when they teach, in this very, regimented, preparing you for a high stakes, test?
I think it's the same answer.
Yeah, no.
They lose themselves.
Yeah,
like
no,
I think
absolutely.
children lose themselves, because I was just laughing about this the other day. My daughter is so much herself and just so authentically herself, and I wonder like, what age do they stop feeling comfortable being themselves? Because I'm wondering, when I like was starting to learn like, silence this part of you, change this part of you. And I think that we as in educators in the school system,
Yeah.
are a part of silencing children's authentic selves.
Yeah.
And then I think as a part of that, we are then silencing our own selves, which is why like, I'm like, nah, I'm actually not doing that. I'm going to
Yeah.
be me. I'm going to encourage you to be you. And I'm going to support you in refining what does that look like to navigate the system in a way that still keeps your humanity intact, integrity intact, but still provides you with access to the things that the world does have to offer for you.
Yeah. That is a great segue into our next question. When we think about high-stakes standardized testing, and when we think about its function, our question, if failure is baked into the design of standardized tests, who benefits from that failure? I want to read a quote from page 78 that talks about that failure. Cut scores for judging of passing or proficiency is entirely political. All standardized tests are designed to produce what's called a bell curve because they are designed to produce some amount of failure. If I was a parent and a teacher told me, hey, we're going to take this test in March and your child might fail, but they might pass, but they're guaranteed to fail or pass. I'll be like, what is that? So when I think about the bell curve, I think about this idea that whoever takes this test, there's going to be somebody that's not going to pass. And that just inherently feels like an inequitable experience because why do you design a test for a student to fail? But of course
Capitalism.
exactly, that's what
That's
I'm
what I
gonna
was
Of
saying.
course that has to
I was
happen
like, that's
because
life
we have to
right now
justify the
for
test.
us.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a thing. Like, that's life right now for us. Is somebody's gonna have to lose. Everybody's not gonna be the millionaire. Everybody's not gonna be the billionaire. Like business owner. Everyone's not gonna be that. And that's the unfortunate part of capitalism is that someone has to be discarded because that's what keeps the system going.
Yeah.
And I think, yes, in its inception, that is how standardized testing was made, but it's also like a reflection of capitalism,
Yeah.
which is what the students then have to exist in when they leave school, when they leave K through 12 education, where
Yeah.
they get a job, everyone's not going to be successful, layoffs, all these things that model someone got to lose.
Yeah.
Don't let it be you.
And the cut scores are not scientific. It's a political thing. It is someone is creating that magic number that students have to get or that high schoolers have to get for you to get into, that selective enrollment high school or, that prestigious college. But it all feels like an illusion because this is not getting at the learning experience that prepares students for life. This is getting at I'm going to make $1 billion off of selling this test to this school district, and I'm invested in it, even if it means a student has now internalized that they are not, smart because they didn't do well.
Yeah, and I think if we're playing devil's advocate, like, what does it mean for them to be prepared for life? Like, is it them being prepared to be in a system where you might not win?
Yeah,
And like, how are you
that's the point.
navigating that? And I think that, like, we often make the argument that school systems are insufficient because they don't teach you about how to navigate life. But it's like, is it? I think they're actually very similar to how life operates. There are going to be people that are successful. There are going to be people that were supported and that's what got to their success. There are people that were not supported and got to their success. There are people that were not supported and are not doing well, are in a jail right now, which I would argue that's death.
Yeah.
Once you go to jail, and recidivism rates show that, like, all those things show that.
Yeah.
And so I think that it begs the question of like what you think preparing them for life means.
Yeah. I think when I think about preparing for life, I think about how I manage my stress, the boundaries that I learn to set for myself and with other people, the way in which I, manage all of my range of emotions. I think these are things that we assume are taught, within a family unit or, you learn them through your social experiences. But I do believe, and I'm getting at emotional intelligence, I do believe that there is, and research shows it, that we have to do better, at doing more direct instruction with children of all ages, with these other life skills, that we historically have not prioritized in school. And so when I think about preparing students for life, I think about, is there going to be a high stakes standardized test to measure a student's emotional intelligence? I don't know. But, I think that might be a better test to give students because, if you can't emotionally regulate yourself, you might be in a world of trouble for a variety of reasons. I do want to pivot because I want to talk about who benefits when students fail. Like they're taking this test, they don't pass it. Who is benefiting? Obviously, the corporations that create these tests, administer these tests. I also think that there is organizations, I'll name them, PWIs, predominantly white institutions, where we have so many white students going to these institutions and so few black students. Why is that the case? A part of that is this gatekeeper of me not doing well in this test, and so me being disqualified out the gate from attending this college that um, is could be life-changing for me. So.
Yeah, I think you answered your own question though. Like I think that structural violence is structural violence because there are structures created to
Yeah.
prohibit certain groups of people from having access to
Yeah.
things. And it's when the structure was created, it wasn't like, oh, this type of person, this type of person. It was like only the elite will win.
Yes.
Only the elite will survive, and whatever the elite looks like is going to be what it is based on history and the things that have happened. And that serves to keep the system going. Like it serves to like create this individualism and like only some of us can win. So now I need to hustle harder and keep the machine going.
Yeah.
Where it's like, if that wasn't the case and everybody won, how would the machine keep going, right? And I think,
and it wouldn't, because no one would make money. So
yeah,
and thus capitalism.
Yeah,
So
yep.
There is, as we pivot to our next question, there is something that I'm thinking about, and what I'm thinking about is how we move forward. Because we're gonna present some numbers in a minute about what the state of standardized testing is as of 2024. Our next question asks is, what does school look like and feel like for kids who are in systems where testing failure dictates everything? I want to share a couple of numbers from the National Assessment Governing Board. The National Assessment Governing Board also creates policies for the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And that's like the gold standard for national student achievement data in the United States. So they published some numbers in January of 2025. And I just want to read some of these numbers off. So around 40% of fourth graders within the United States are working below the National Assessment of Educational Progress basic level in reading, the largest percentage since 2002. It's wild. That's like 23 years of us failing nearly half of fourth graders.
Yeah. I mean, 60% of the United States does not read above an 8th grade reading level. So these numbers don't surprise me. I don't think they're alarming to me, especially when I know from working in systems about like, what students are experiencing.
Yeah.
And I think this quote that is from our text, one of the central ways that high-stakes standards tests have operated in support of white supremacy is through their disparate impact on Black and Latinx students testing. And I think that like that is why we see the numbers that we see. Like we're not teaching in a way that is setting students up with like basic reading, writing. And we talked about this in the car ride here. Like when I was in school, I went to school with predominantly people that didn't look like me. And in the in-school suspension space, in the detentions every week, like I would see only people that looked like me. And we made up maybe less than 10% of the school population.
Yeah.
So they weren't learning. If every day I'm in school suspension, I'm not learning how to read on grade level. I already came in not learning how to read on grade level. When does that change? It doesn't.
Yeah.
Like I just get pushed along because someone's like, I don't want to deal with this. So I'm just push them to the next grade.
Yeah.
Now I can't read and I'm graduating high school.
Exactly. And it's tragic. I think it's really sad that, from 2002 until 2025, like we're still failing like a ton of children. And, if children are not reading at a fourth grade level, then that means they're perpetually behind for the, rest of their career, their educational career. One of the things that I'm also thinking about is this idea that, in predominantly Black and brown schools, the testing drives everything. I've been teaching for or was teaching, for a solid 5.5, 6 years. And every year there was conversations every month about standardized testing leading up to the tests. And so, when you learn to teach in a test heavy, focused, this is what we're doing every day in a lesson to prepare students for this test. It's disheartening. I remember feeling my third year that I did not, in teaching, that I was tired of hearing about the IAR tests every day. I think we know that it's a gatekeeper to, at least for Chicago, for sure, to some of the best high schools in the city. But when we, have this conversation about the impact that this kind of culture, educational culture has on children, is disheartening.
Yeah, I don't know that I experienced it as disheartening. I think how I experienced it was, I don't know, like I think test scores fund the schools. Like test scores fund at least our charter schools. And so I think that, you know, it makes sense that if funding is going to stop because our kids are not testing at whatever level, I also think like, what are the means then we going to use to assess whether or not, specifically if we're speaking about charter schools, are effective if we're not looking at test scores? If students are not performing comparable to non-charter schools or better, what is the purpose of them existing? And so I think that is why, in my mind, at least how I've experienced being in charter, it makes sense because it's like, you have to be able to prove that you're effective to be in existence. Yeah. And I actually think people have a lot of critiques about what's happening right now with charters in Chicago because they've risen the bar of like what they need to do to prove their efficacy.
Yeah.
When it's like, no, they need we need to say why we are effective.
Yeah.
Or we shouldn't exist.
I think one argument that is made in our book is this idea that we are deemed effective because students score high on these tests, but
are they scoring high?
But I mean, no. But I mean, the idea is that if they score high on the test, they're effective. But why is the test itself the measurement of success? And I think that is,
because of funding.
Where we well, not necessarily because of funding, but just if standardized testing is the measurement of success, but then we have a population of people who do not understand civics, do not understand how the government works, do not understand how to, again, regulate themselves emotionally. I'm thinking about all of the different mass shootings that we've had in a decade or so. Did we succeed? Were we successful? Or was this another tragedy of what plays out when we live in a capitalistic country where, the systems that exist, yes, the student is successful, but someone is, profiting off of their success. Sometimes it feels like an illusion to me. And so I feel like, for me, I'm just always living in that moment of, yes, I want these students to be successful on this high stakes test because we know the impact that it will have if they're not. And, what is the thing that we need to do to just like disrupt the thing behind the thing?
I think that makes sense. I think that that's why I think context is important because I think that, I hear that critique, and I think how I experience the duality is around the fact that I've seen very brilliant Black boys who were not believed in, and we know, like our student that we lost last year, who very brilliant kid, is now gone, right? And or like ones that like I taught and that are now in jail, right? Like, and I think about how them having belief that you could be successful or you could find success with your brilliance via the route of college, via the route of having your own business could have deterred them from a different life.
Yeah.
And I'm constantly met with that duality as well. As much as I would love to say, like, let's hyper focus on X because it's what's better for developing the whole child, I think it's a both and situation.
I agree.
Because I think that students still need the tools to navigate the system we are in. Unless the system magically goes away, like they still need to be able to navigate it. And we need to develop the whole child by also supporting with therapy services, with like robust social emotional learning. Like those things need to be present as well. But I think people always often lean on what the easier, theory, the easier thing to do, which is prepare them for the test so that they have access to college in that way. But then we see when kids go to college, they're not finishing their freshman year. They're dropping out. They're not finding sustained success
Yeah, yeah.
because of the other things that you named.
Yes, yes. And a lot of students, at the end of the day, like, they are very, 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 very invested in being successful. You know, I don't know that any child comes to school wanting to fail,
Yeah, no.
or not wanting to learn, and so I think it's for me, it feels like a conversation that needs to continue about what success looks like academically. It's not the test, though the test is the gatekeeper that we have to contend with. And that brings us to this reimagining of what, assessments can be for students. On page 33 of our novel, it states, high stakes standardized testing are unequal by design. This means that we can design something different if we choose to. And that really resonates with me as we think about our next question. If inequity and violence are design choices, what would it look like to intentionally redesign assessment around liberation, cultural wealth, and community power? There's a couple of different recommendations that our author gives in the book. I did list two here because I felt that they were a different way of assessing. One of them is student self-assessment, where students reflect on the work they've done and articulate whether or not and how that work demonstrates mastery of learning objective. And I think that, for me, is like the higher level of thinking, that students can do on the form of assessment. I don't know if you agree or disagree.
I mean, when I was in the classroom, we used to have students do. I used to have them do like a self-assessment on their like scientific writing.
Okay.
And then they would assess their peers, then they would assess their work, and then they would switch papers or whatever, and then they would correct their work.
Yeah.
Like, I think that there are modes in which students can engage in more critical thinking that can exist currently in the system that we have. But I also think, to your question here about what would it look like to intentionally redesign assessment around liberation, culture, wealth, and community power, I think that there are schools attempting to do this for sure. And I think that looks like interrogating the modes in which students are assessed. I think that looks at like thinking about the content in which students are engaged in. Like, sometimes, and that's what I was going to say earlier about the standardized tests. If you look at standardized test questions, oftentimes the texts that are used, like the questions that are asked, require a schema that Black and brown students don't have, because that's not a part of their cultural experience, right? And so I think that's what's also hard, is that we're having to teach a level of double consciousness in a way that we might not be able to teach fast enough to set them up for success by the time they get to the ACT.
Yeah.
And so
epistemic violence,
racial
cultural knowledge,
Boom.
it doesn't exist in a test
that
is administered.
And I think there's an assumed
exactly.
And there's like an assumed objectivity, right? Like, and I firmly believe objectivity is not real. And the reason why I say that is because who we are and how we show up in the world and our lived experiences, all of that informs every single thing that I do. Like, someone walks into the room, everything that I've experienced about everyone in the world is going to inform how I interpret this person coming into the room, right? So for us to assume objectivity or pretend we can be objective is just false. And it creates a world in which oftentimes dominant narratives are centered unintentionally because we are presuming objectivity, which we know is not real. And so I think that the hard part about this is, like, even if we created curriculum systems centered around liberation, cultural wealth, etc., the person deploying the instruction has to also interrogate what they think about it to execute it in the way in which we're hoping it lands. Which we see sometimes that doesn't happen.
I think the other thing is that some of the alternative ways of assessing students, it's very labor intensive. One of them was giving student feedback, as a way of assessing students, and that's great. And 36 students in a classroom, if you have 3 classes, that's 100 plus students. Like, that's very labor intensive. There is one other assessment alternative that the book mentions that I thought is also a great way to assess students. Portfolios and public defenses of student work, where students spend a substantial amount of time, usually weeks, building a portfolio based on the teacher's criteria for success or learning objectives. And so I think that when we think about, neurodivergent students who are multilingual, they show their learning in a variety of ways. And so when I think about like student portfolios, this is a way for you to capture all of the different ways that this student has learned the content versus, a test.
Yeah, for sure. And I think to your point about labor intensive, I think that the confines of the school day, the school system make that a very aspirational thing. Like if it's like a 1-to-12 ratio, cool. But like when I got 36 kids, it's way easier for me to give this three multiple choice questions.
You're right.
And be they got it, they didn't get it, they got it, they didn't get it. Right. Like, and I think that that's the thing is like, again, back to funding, a lot of these schools are funded off of the amount of students that are in that school. And so when we think about that, schools are packing the amount of students to get the funding, and that is in turn impacting teachers. Because now I have to figure out how to still do all the aspirational things that we're talking about and be a human and not hijack my capacity. And that's
difficult.
hard.
I do think that's why it's so important for us to, we have to think about this now. Like, we know that change takes time. It's moving, a mountain to make that progress. But we also know that at the end of the day, the impact is children. And we have to begin to think about, what does it look like to assess learning in a way that centers, students' humanity? Because right now it is not, it's very much so centered from a business standpoint, because we know, education assessment testing is a billion-dollar industry, and there's a lot of money to be made, and it's not, and it's at the detriment of children, and it's not to the benefit, of every child at the end of the day. And so I think it's a heavy question to ask, but it's one that we have to continue to grapple with.
For sure.
So we are at the end of our discussion. Man, this is powerful. One of the things that I want to ask our readers, educators, parents, students, what do you think you can do to disrupt this system? For educators, assessment, alternative testing, such as what we talked about, portfolios and public defense and students defending their work, student self-assessments, performance tasks, project-based learning projects, and then just advocating, students, parents, teachers, leaders, yes, for a different way of assessing learning that is not rooted in, what we see when we look at high-stakes standardized testing.
Yeah. I also think what's super important here is that if you're leading schools and you're at the table when policies are being made, it's super important that you're able to name the thing, right? And we continue to say this, what we don't name, we normalize, because if you're not naming these violences, how they show up structurally or epistemically, if you're not naming it, it's not going to be addressed. And it is our responsibility as the people that hold the knowledge to interrupt and disrupt spaces that are not serving the highest good of our students. And we're not saying it like it's an overnight fix. It is going to take intentionality, labor, patience, but it is something that today is the first day where you can get started.
Yes. And so our call to action for you today is, if we know, as we've talked about, that standardized testing has historically reproduced inequality, narrowed the curriculum that we teach children, and has erased the genius of the Black and brown multilingual and neurodivergent students, then it is our responsibility to build something better, to design the assessments that my co talked about, that reflects real world problem solving, that measures growth instead of gaps, and that lets students demonstrate their understanding in multiple modes and languages. This was a great conversation. If you would like to join this conversation, please visit educationincontext.org. Thank you.